1991, the budget that changed India. No power on earth can stop an idea whose time has come. Let the whole world hear it loud and clear. India is now wide awake. We shall prevail. We shall overcome.
Hello and welcome to this India Today special. 30 years ago, this weekend, Dr. Manmohan Singh, then Finance Minister in the Narsimha Rao government, delivered a union budget that changed India forever. June 24, 1991 was the moment, the time that promised to unleash the animal spirits of the Indian economy that at the time was the 19th poorest in the world. Since then, the world has changed. India has changed dramatically. Today, we look back and ahead to assess whether the dreams of the 1991 economic liberalization budget have been fulfilled or remain a case of missed opportunities. My first guest on this special show is someone who was an integral part of Team Rao Manmohan, then Commerce Minister P. Chidambaram, who of course later on went on to deliver the most budgets after Dr. Singh's 1991 budget. P. Chidambaram, appreciate your joining us on the show. My first question to you is a question that's always intrigued me. If India didn't have that foreign exchange crisis in 1991, we were on the verge of a default, barely 2 weeks of payments for imports, would we have gone in for this major change in the union budget of 1991, opening up the Indian markets?
Yes, I think so. Because I think more than the foreign exchange crisis, more than the balance of payment crisis, the most critical factor was Dr. Manmohan Singh was finance minister. He was not going to be finance minister to just continue to do what previous finance ministers had done for several decades. Remember, he was part of the South-South Commission, and he had absorbed a very different perspective of the world economy. And cometh the time, cometh the man, or the right time, the right man, and I must say the right Prime Minister, who was willing to let the finance minister and other ministers do their job. I think we would have done what we did. We may not have done it in the first 30 days, but I think over a period of 5 years, Dr. Manmohan Singh would have done exactly what he did in those 5 years.
You know, it's interesting the way you're putting it, because many will give the real credit to Prime Minister Narsimha Rao, who, remember, was a Prime Minister of a minority government of which you were a part, and there was a belief that it was Mr. Rao who got the political heft for a budget. Because give us a sense that a minority government slowly dismantling government controls couldn't have been easy. What was the biggest challenge, in a sense, at the time? Many of today's viewers will perhaps not recognize the challenges that were faced in 1991 to dismantle government controls.
The biggest challenge was very, very few people in the government, including civil servants. They can be counted on the fingers of maybe two hands, understood what the macroeconomy was. We are all experts on the microeconomy, but very few people understood what the macroeconomy was. And within the cabinet, there was formidable opposition to any change from the old Nehru, Indira Gandhi path. A few people remembered that Mr. Rajiv Gandhi himself had undergone a change. His thinking was different, and his manifesto for 1991 promised a different economic regime. So I think the biggest obstacle to change was within the cabinet. I don't wish to take names. These names are well known. They have been written about, spoken about. The cabinet was a formidable opponent of any change. Mr. Narsimha Rao's contribution was his ability to manage that opposition. Otherwise, Dr. Manmohan Singh could not have done what he did or I could not have done what I did in trade reforms. We could not have done what we did in the new industrial policy resolution. Mr. Narsimha Rao took over the burden of managing the political opposition within the cabinet.
One more question. You've delivered 8 budgets since 1991, the maximum, full budgets that is. What is the one thing you feel the country has gained since 1991? And what is the biggest missed opportunity? Because there will be those who will say, this is also a glass half empty. We simply didn't grow and pick up opportunities as fast as we could. So what's the biggest gain? What's the biggest missed opportunity, Mr. Chidambaram?
The biggest gain is we proved to the country, the people, the political parties, that India could achieve 9% growth. 9% was beyond everybody's wildest dreams. We have never achieved 9% growth. We proved that with correct policies and a good administration, we could deliver 9% growth, not a flash in the pan for 1 year, but for 3 to 4 years running, we could deliver 9% growth. Which is why today, when people are faced with 5% or 6% growth, they say this is inadequate. But remember, at one point of time, 5 to 6% was considered tremendous growth. That is the biggest gain. The ability of the government, the willingness of the government and the people to believe that India can achieve 9% growth, which was reserved only for the Asian tigers and China. India could do that. The biggest disappointment is we have not had a politically consistent system or administration which can make sure that growth is sustained over a long period of time. See, China's great advantage was it sustained high growth for something like 15, 20 years. We could sustain high growth only for 3 or 4 years. After that, we fell back. Then we picked up a bit. We fell back again. And now we are at the nadir. We are at the bottom of the pit.
But Mr. Chidambaram, would you broadly agree that in these 30 years, whether it was Team Rao Manmohan, then you as part of the United Front government, Vajpayee ji with Yashwant Singh as finance ministers, the Manmohan Singh cabinet with you as finance minister, Pranab Mukherjee, going down to the Narendra Modi government with Arun Jaitley, now Nirmala Sitharaman, broadly, most finance ministers in these 30 years have committed to reform. The pace may have slowed down at various times, but the broad commitment, would you agree, over these 30 years has remained consistent?
No, I don't agree with that. The verbal commitment to reform is not the same as bringing the intellectual input to actually do reforms. Of the names that you mentioned, I will only agree that Mr. Yashwant Singh had the capacity to bring about reforms. I'm afraid the others may have made a verbal commitment to reform, but they did not bring to the table the tools and did not bring to the table actual reforms in the mold that we associate with Dr. Manmohan Singh.
On that note, Mr. Chidambaram, I appreciate your joining us, giving us a sense of what July 1991 was all about. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay, let's broaden this entire issue of 1991, 30 years later. I'm joined by Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, former Deputy Chairman, Planning Commission, an integral part of Team Rao Manmohan in 1991. Dr. Shankar Acharya, former Chief Economic Advisor, served several governments in that turbulent decade of the 1990s in particular. Ajit Ranade, Chief Economist at the Aditya Birla Group. I want to start with you, Dr. Ahluwalia, because you were very much part of those moments in July 1991. Your recollections, your memories of that day in particular, July 24th, as Dr. Singh prepared to deliver that budget?
Well, it was clearly going to be a very important day. But, you know, I have to point out that the big things had already been done. The two-step devaluation took place on the 1st and 3rd of July. The associated very major trade policy changes which liberalized trade and kind of talked about moving to a market exchange rate at some point. That had already been done. On the 4th of July, Chidambaram gave a press conference outlining the whole thing. And the industrial policy, which was also a very major transformation from what was the normal thing in the past, that had been done before the budget. The really important thing about the budget was that, unlike the usual budgets, which kept listing either this tax change or the other tax change, or this program or the other program, the budget speech, in my view, was quite historic because it, for the first time, pulled together all these things and explained what the logic of acting on these different interrelated areas was. There's no other budget speech that has actually done that. In fact, if you look at the content of what was done in the budget, it was very little. I mean, the most important things had already been done. And what the finance minister did in Parliament was to provide an explanation of the rationale of economic policy change that took place. I think he also, two very important things, this is important, that he didn't actually announce so many changes, but he announced two very important initiatives which guided policy in the years ahead. One was the appointment of the Raja Chalaya committee, which was going to make recommendations on tax reform. I mean, instead of simply outlining some tax proposals, what he did was he set up this very high-level committee, very distinguished participants, including some people, tax accountants, very distinguished tax accountants, etc., and said, look, you lay out what should be the structure of our tax reform. That report was made public, and then the implementation of that took place over the next 2 or 3 years. Similarly, and of course that included recommendations on reducing import duties. Similarly, he appointed the Narsimha Committee, which outlined the directions of financial sector reforms. But the actual directions were not announced in the budget. The actual directions got known towards the end of the year when the reports came in.
But I have to ask you this. I know when 25 years of liberalization, I read an interview of yours saying there had been missed opportunities. We could have done much more in a shorter period of time. What do you believe has been the biggest missed opportunity and the biggest gain? Do you believe that?
Well, I think there's no question that we should have moved faster. And I've written about this on more than one occasion. I mean, I think I'm not a great believer in what is called big bang reform, do everything in 1 year or two. In a democracy, reforms are going to lead to an impact from people. You need to listen to them. You need to see what their concerns are. And you need to be able to bring them, carry them along. And, very often with a little bit of persuasion, I mean, people like expressing their reservations, but they do ultimately go along. I'll give you one example, which I think always struck me as very interesting. That, when computerization had to be introduced in the early 1990s, the bank unions were totally opposed to computerization. And a whole group of union leaders came to call on the finance minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh. And he was explaining to them that, look, India can't not have computerization of the banking system. It will simply leave us way behind. None of the leaders actually wanted to change their mind. But when they left the room, I mean, Dr. Singh, being a very polite person, sort of shook hands with each of them, went to the door of his room and shook hands with each of them as they left. And one of them said to him, Mr. Finance Minister, I am not at all persuaded by your argument, but I don't mind telling you that my son agrees with you. So, I think you need to recognize that there will be differences of view, but in the end, I think it's the nature of a healthy political process that you generate some kind of a consensus. And I think the Rao regime handled that quite well. Of course, it meant it took longer. I mean, I personally think that what took 30 years up to now could have been compressed in 15. But that's really a management of politics issue, which only a politician can comment on.
that's an issue that I want to take to Dr. Shankaracharya, because you worked with subsequent governments, Dr. Acharya, in that period. Do you believe that we could have done things faster, better, that all the, Dr. Singh in his 91 budget said India's time has come, but 30 years later, there are those who are saying we're still waiting really for India's time truly to have come. Do you believe we could have done these things much faster?
Well, technically we could have, but as Montek mentions, the art of policy, I suppose, at any given point is what can you do which is politically possible. Now, that in a way justifies everything, so I don't want to be saying that. Undoubtedly, I think it would have been both better and probably feasible to do various reforms earlier. I mean, just take the whole, what's often called the factor market reforms, labor reforms, land market reforms. As we know that, this has been a huge struggle for successive governments for the last 30 years. And we haven't made a whole lot of progress. And yet, I mean, I remember there was back in 1993, there was a cabinet paper to rewrite parts of the Industrial Disputes Act. Of course, that's only one law, but it was an important one regarding the labor issues. But it didn't go anywhere because people felt at that time, at the political level, that, look, we are doing as much as we can on the other fronts, and so we don't want to take on too many fronts at the same time. And that was a political judgment.
But Dr. Acharya, a lot of the editorial comment that one reads on liberalization today is either that, while it did lift a number of Indians out of poverty, while it was essential, it's also now led to greater inequalities. It's the argument is led to crony capitalism. Are those issues still relevant, you think, or it is now time to sort of believe that reform simply cannot be stopped? It's an unstoppable move forward.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think, when I look back on the last 30 years, I certainly don't see a train that is consistently moving forward. I think I see a train which has gone forward in spurts, come to a sort of near halt at times, gone into a siding at times. And, it depends very much on what period you are talking about. I mean, just to give you a summary of my view, and I'm not expecting others to necessarily agree with this, including Monte, but I've also written about it, so it's not a new view. Looking back over the last 30 years, I would say that it's really the first 13 between 1991 and 2004, where though you had three different governments, Congress, then United Front for 2 years in between, and then 6 years of the NDA under Vajpayee, I would say those 13 years, there was a much more consistency of purpose, not necessarily on the same subjects, but sort of across a wide sort of array, which, if you take those 13 years as a whole, were really very good. But I'm not sure that after those 13 years had lapsed, getting to 2004, for example, onwards, you've had a decade of UPA, and then, of course, you've had 7 years of the NDA too. Now, I think one, in my view, a mistake that is often made is saying, look, it's during the years, particularly 2003 to 2011, that you had the fastest growth in India. And that's factually true, at least insofar as one takes official data at face value, which I do broadly at that time. Namely, you had 8.5% average growth over that period. And you had, other things which were reasonable. I mean, there was inflation at times, but nothing out of the ordinary. And sort of other macro parameters were also quite good. And poverty was being alleviated.
Right.
You have data, official data, of household surveys up to about 2012 or thereabouts. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that during that time, the policy changes that were being made in the UPA were terrific. On the contrary, I would say that, in a sense, the decade of UPA was rather low on productivity enhancing reforms across the Indian economy. There were political reasons for it. Remember that
So
the left.
you're saying it's not
was
been
giving-
you're saying it's not been a consistent trend forward. It's been a train that stopped at various times. A lot of reforms have been done by stealth at times, rather than privatization has been stop-start at times. So has disinvestment. I want to turn to Ajit Ranade to give our viewers a sense. There are a lot of young millennials who'll watch and will say, why are you making such a big deal of 1991? In fact, when we were planning this program, I was asked by a producer who was actually born after 1991, asking me, why are you making such a big deal of it? For this generation, how do you explain why 1991 matters?
Well, indeed, Rajdeep, India's median age is 27. So half of India has been born after the reforms. So it's a legitimate question to answer. But just look at our neighbor China. In 2018, they celebrated 40 years of reforms. They started their reforms 13 years before us. And if you have to use a benchmark, it's we always look at our northern neighbor. And the kind of achievements you have seen in China often become a benchmark by discussing what India could have achieved. So one thing is to look at our own achievements, which are quite spectacular in its own way, because since 1991 till today, our GDP is 10 times bigger in dollar terms, 1,000% increase. During this time, our population has gone up only by 46 or 50%. So it's compared to our own record, it's spectacular. But then when we compare it to what is possible, by looking not just at China, but some of our East Asian neighbors, Southeast Asia, that's when you realize that actually much more is possible in the realm of, given the different political systems, despite that.
So do you believe
instance,
the rise of this sort of middle class, this affluent, relatively more affluent middle class, is 1991 the starting point of that?
Yes, in fact, that's the promise. You see, for example, the biggest announcement of 91 was industrial delicensing. So the share of industry in GDP back then in 1991 was merely 16%. But 30 years later, it is still 16%. Agriculture has gone down from 30% to about 14%. So what we were not able to achieve is the kind of industrial expansion we are seeing in East Asian countries. So because middle class growth, one industrial job, one blue collar job spawns about 5 or 6 service sector jobs.
Right.
So that's actually, and it also, the employment creation. So I would say share of industry could have gone higher. Agriculture reforms, agriculture has gone down its share in income to 14%, but the percentage of the population of the workforce which depends still on agriculture directly or indirectly is still close to 50%. And thirdly, while of course GDP is 10 times bigger, per capita incomes have gone up by 6 times, but unfortunately inequality, as you said earlier, is also wider. I think it's a global phenomenon, but in these times, especially after 2008-9, with ultra loose monetary policy, what has happened is stock market wealth has risen much faster than GDP or income. So therefore, people who derive incomes from the stock market or wealth effect, that is showing up as inequality. Now, of course, one can debate whether we should focus on inequality reduction or poverty reduction.
Right.
And one can make an argument that poverty is more important in the earlier stages. But as we go forward, I think we will have to worry about rising inequality, not just in income terms, in wealth terms, in access to quality healthcare and education, in regional terms, in gender and other dimensions of social dimensions.
Therefore, as we sort of conclude, Dr. Acharya, what for you would be the biggest challenge? Once again, to put it in perspective, in 1991, we were the 19th poorest country in the world, although our foreign exchange reserves, remember, were down to just 2 weeks of imports. India's foreign trade had fallen to 0.5% of global trade. The entire market cap of the BSE 100 was just $45 billion. So we can contrast that with what was then. So for a lot of young people, this was the India of then, when if I had to go abroad, I had to be careful. Was I crossing my $500 limit? For you, Dr. Acharya, in conclusion, if there's one thing that you'd like to see change in the next 30 years that will truly unleash the animal spirits of our economy, what would that be?
I'll tell you 2 or 3 things, if I may. First, I mean, we've done a bad job on job creation. Our employment data, the latest that you have, are much worse today than they were 10 years ago. So we have not created the kind of job-creating machine that China and the East Asian countries did. A lot of it is to do with they were much more aggressive globalizers. We've been much more half-hearted. And indeed, when I talked about the train stopping and going into sidings, I think in the last 4 years, for example, but you can find examples even before that, we have essentially sometimes gone back on policy when it comes to protectionism and things like that. And education, if you look around the world and look at what we have or have not achieved in the last 30 years, I would say that has been a big failure, especially at the primary and secondary levels. Not in terms of enrollment, what's learned or not learned in our schools, and you have the annual Asar reports by Pratham and various other surveys like that, and they show that it's been now 15 years, and those data don't seem to change much.
So you'd say that in the next 30 years, we've got to get our act together when it comes to improving quality of education, access to quality education, presumably, and also ensure job creation. These are two critical areas that you're looking at. Mr. Ranade, I think you suggested that critical is focusing on infrastructure, manufacturing, industry. That it's not enough to be a service sector driven economy. We're going to have to get our manufacturing act together. Either way, I think as we look back at the last 30 years, we've come a long way. I think we can say that with some degree of certainty through all the hiccups, we've come a very long way. And that's why I think 1991 July is an important day in India's history. For now, Dr. Shankaracharya, Dr. Ranade, and Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, I appreciate your joining us on this India Today special. Thank you so much. Okay, whichever way you look at it then, India has come a long way from July 1991. The caged tiger has slowly come out of the cage to the point where we are one of the fastest growing economies in the world with plentiful foreign exchange reserves in contrast to July 1991. Most of all, we have built this middle class energy, and that's the energy which allows all of us in a way to celebrate July 24th, 1991. On that note, thanks for watching, and maybe say a little thank you to Narsimha Rao, Manmohan Singh, and those who followed them. Bye for now.